Iran has been hit by strikes so many times over the past 6 months that another one barely registers as breaking news anymore. Military sites, missile facilities, nuclear infrastructure. The list has grown so long that most people scrolling past another headline about bombs falling on Iran assume it's simply more of the same. This latest wave isn't more of the same. For the first time in this entire war, American and Israeli forces have deliberately, explicitly shifted their targeting towards something they'd previously avoided hitting directly at this scale: the power plants, refineries, and energy infrastructure that keep ordinary Iranian life running. Tonight, we're going to show you exactly why that shift matters, why it connects directly to a vulnerability we flagged months before it was actually struck, and why targeting a country's energy grid rather than its military changes the entire calculus of how a war like this actually ends. You would think, after everything Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure has already absorbed, that there wouldn't be much left worth specifically targeting. Instead, what's happened over the past several weeks represents something genuinely new in this conflict's trajectory. The ceasefire that had held for months finally collapsed, and when the strikes resumed, they didn't return to the same military and nuclear targets that defined the war's opening phase. Multiple U.S. sources confirmed that Washington and Israel were planning what they described as one of the harshest bombing campaigns to date, specifically against energy infrastructure, power plants, and refineries, rather than the military command centers and missile facilities that had dominated the target lists since February. Before we go further, you need to understand exactly what triggered this specific shift, because the sequence matters enormously here. The President of America posted publicly that he would bomb and destroy an Iranian bridge or power plant for every attack on a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, an explicit, direct linkage between Iranian actions against shipping and American retaliation against civilian energy infrastructure specifically. That's a fundamentally different kind of threat than anything issued earlier in this war. Previous American statements had focused on military capability, nuclear facilities, missile production, the kinds of targets a government can frame as purely defensive necessity. A promise to destroy a power plant for every attacked ship is something else entirely, a direct, publicly stated linkage between economic pressure on Iran's population and Iran's own military behavior in the Strait. Let's talk about how this specific threat differs from the language American officials used earlier in the war, because the shift in tone itself is revealing. Earlier strikes were consistently described using careful, technical military language, degrading command and control, disrupting missile production, eliminating nuclear enrichment capacity, framing every target as serving a specific, defensible operational purpose. President of America public statement about bombing a bridge or power plant for every ship attacked in the Strait uses none of that careful framing. It's blunt, transactional, and explicitly tied to civilian infrastructure rather than military capability, a rhetorical shift that Iranian officials have seized on directly, arguing it exposes this phase of the campaign as retaliatory rather than defensive in nature. Let's talk about why this particular threshold matters so much, because it connects directly to something we've covered in detail before. Iran's entire power generation system, however dispersed and individually resilient, depends overwhelmingly on natural gas fed from a small number of concentrated sources, chief among them the South Pars gas field, the single largest natural gas field on the planet, supplying up to 70% of the country's total gas production. We told you, before any of this happened, that South Pars represented the one choke point capable of bringing down Iran's entire dispersed power grid at once, a vulnerability sitting quietly underneath the headlines while the world focused on Fordo and Natanz instead. That warning is no longer hypothetical. On March 18th, Israel struck Iran's gas and oil sites directly at South Pars and the nearby Assalouya refinery complex, an attack that damaged roughly 12% of Iran's total gas production and halted output entirely at 2 separate refineries. Let's examine exactly what South Pars represents strategically, because its scale is genuinely difficult to overstate. It's the single largest natural gas field on the entire planet, shared between Iran and Qatar, which calls its own portion North Dome, and Iran's side alone accounts for the overwhelming majority of the natural gas feeding the country's power plants, heating systems, and industrial processes simultaneously. A field this large isn't simply one energy asset among many for Iran. It's the foundational input underneath nearly the entire civilian and industrial economy at once, which is exactly why a strike causing only 12% production damage still managed to force a complete halt in gas exports to an entire neighboring country and send immediate shockwaves through global oil markets within hours of the attack being confirmed. Let's put that specific strike in front of you clearly, because it represents the first real-world confirmation of exactly the mechanism we'd flagged as Iran's most dangerous, hidden vulnerability. The damage from that single attack forced Iran to halt gas supply exports to Iraq entirely, and triggered immediate spikes in oil prices on global markets within hours. This wasn't a strike on a military target that happened to have some civilian side effects. It was a direct hit on the specific choke point feeding Iran's civilian electricity, heating, and industrial gas supply simultaneously, striking at the exact structural weakness that makes Iran's dispersed, individually resilient power plants collectively vulnerable in a way no single power plant strike could ever achieve on its own. Let's talk about how oil and gas markets actually processed this specific strike in real time, because the financial reaction tells you how seriously traders around the world took the significance of hitting South Pars directly. Oil and gas prices moved higher within hours of the March 18th attack. A reaction financial analysts specifically attributed to South Par's unique role in Iran's energy architecture rather than treating it as just another strike among dozens documented the month. That kind of immediate, measurable market reaction stands in contrast to how markets have responded to purely military strikes throughout this war, which have generally produced far more muted, short-lived price movements, evidence that global energy traders themselves clearly understood this specific target represented a different category of risk than a missile factory or a radar installation. Now, let's talk about what happened just weeks before that South Pars strike, because it shows this wasn't the war's opening move against energy infrastructure. It was an escalation of a pattern already underway. On March 7th, Israel had already struck several Iranian fuel sites in Tehran and the neighboring city of Karaj, describing the operation as a significant strike specifically targeting fuel storage and energy complexes that Israeli officials claimed were being used by Iran's armed forces. That earlier strike provided the justification, military logistics support, that later attacks on South Pars itself didn't need to rely on nearly as heavily once the pattern of targeting Iran's broader energy infrastructure had already been established as part of this war's accepted scope. Let's talk about President of America's own reaction to that initial South Pars strike, because it reveals something important about how coordinated or uncoordinated this energy targeting campaign has actually been across the war's different phases. Reports at the time indicated President of America said he was unaware Israel had struck South Pars before it happened, and publicly warned Iran to stop its own attacks in response, a reaction suggesting the March strike may have originated more from Israeli initiative than from carefully coordinated joint American-Israeli strategy. That's a meaningfully different picture than the tightly coordinated, publicly announced energy campaign being planned by August, where American and Israeli sources both confirmed direct coordination well before any strikes actually occurred. In other words, the war's energy targeting dimension appears to have evolved from an improvised, occasionally uncoordinated escalation in March into a deliberate, jointly planned, strategic pillar by the time this latest wave arrived. A genuine shift in how seriously both governments now treat energy infrastructure as a primary lever in this conflict. Let's talk about the scale of what's actually at stake in this latest wave specifically, because the numbers involved go well beyond any single power plant or refinery. Since this war began, the United States and Israel have hit military bases and leaders across Iran, but have also increasingly targeted civilian infrastructure, damage that regional analysts describe as requiring years and extensive investment to fully rebuild. That bombing campaign has directly worsened Iran's internal economic woes, contributing to a contracting economy and what regional reporting describes as a major energy imbalance now squeezing more than 90 million ordinary Iranians simultaneously. This isn't a side effect of a war focused elsewhere. It's become one of the war's central deliberate pressure points. Let's talk about the specific military rationale officials have offered for why energy infrastructure has become a higher strategic priority at this particular stage of the war, because the reasoning connects directly to what's already been achieved on the purely military front. After 6 months of sustained strikes, Iran's air defense network, missile production capacity, and nuclear infrastructure have all absorbed extensive, well-documented damage, the kind of degradation that would normally be expected to force a government toward serious negotiation. Iran hasn't fully capitulated diplomatically despite that damage, which is precisely the scenario military strategists say tends to precede a pivot toward economic and infrastructure pressure, applying leverage against a regime's ability to sustain public tolerance for continued conflict, rather than continuing to grind away at military capability that's already been substantially degraded without producing the desired diplomatic outcome. Let's talk about how Iran has responded to this specific shift, because the retaliation pattern tells you Tehran understands exactly what's being targeted and why. Rather than limiting its response purely to military targets, Iran's Revolutionary Guard and regular army have specifically struck back at energy infrastructure across the region, hitting facilities in Israel itself, as well as in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman. That's a direct, mirrored escalation. If your energy infrastructure is the target, mine becomes the target too, a tit-for-tat dynamic that threatens to drag an entire region's civilian energy supply into the crossfire of a conflict that started as a dispute over nuclear enrichment and military capability. Let's talk about how this energy targeting shift connects directly to the general's under pressure story we covered previously, because the two threads reinforce each other in ways worth making explicit. A military leadership already strained by repeated decapitation strikes, internal surveillance, and documented resource shortages between its own army and Revolutionary Guard branches now has to manage an additional, entirely new category of crisis, coordinating a national response to energy infrastructure attacks that directly affect the civilian population. Those same generals are ultimately responsible for protecting. Every strike on a power plant or refinery doesn't just damage physical infrastructure, it adds another item to an already overloaded crisis management plate. For a command structure, multiple independent sources describe as operating under unprecedented internal strain. Let's walk through the most recent chapter of this specific pattern, because it's still actively unfolding as we speak. War formally returned to Iran in mid-August after the ceasefire collapsed entirely, with the U.S. military striking at least 5 separate Iranian provinces overnight, hitting what officials described as IRGC command centers, missile and drone facilities, and coastal surveillance infrastructure. Alongside that resumed military campaign, reports confirmed continued coordination between Washington and Israel, specifically around energy targets, with President of America explicit ship-for-power plant threat still hanging over every subsequent decision either government makes about the Strait of Hormuz standoff we've covered extensively already. Let's talk about Iran's $30,000 bounty announcement, because it emerged in the exact same window as this renewed fighting and reveals something about the regime's posture heading into this specific escalation. Iran's military publicly announced a bounty equivalent to $30,000 for killing or capturing U.S. soldiers, with the reward doubled if carried out by a woman, an unusual, explicitly provocative announcement timed almost precisely alongside the war's formal resumption in mid-August. Announcements like that one aren't really aimed at producing operational results. They're aimed at domestic morale and demonstrating continued defiance to a population already exhausted by 6 months of war and a summer of blackouts. Exactly the kind of symbolic resolve signaling regimes under this specific combination of military and economic pressure tend to reach for when more substantive options are limited. Let's talk about the specific economic mechanics behind why this shift toward energy targeting is proving so effective as a pressure tool, because it's not simply about denying Iran electricity in the abstract. Iran ranks as the 4th largest natural gas consumer in the world, behind only the United States, China, and Russia, relying heavily on that gas not just for electricity generation, but for heating homes through the country's genuinely harsh winter climate. A strike that damages gas production doesn't just dim the lights during a hot summer. It threatens the infrastructure Iranian families will depend on to stay warm once winter arrives, extending the humanitarian stakes of this specific targeting decision across an entire additional season most coverage of this war hasn't yet fully grappled with. Let's also consider the concern voiced specifically by frustrated Gulf allies about how this energy targeting phase is affecting their own calculations, because their frustration isn't purely about principle, it reflects genuine direct exposure. Reports describing growing Gulf frustration with the President of America administration specifically cite the disruption to regional stability caused by continued Iranian missile and drone strikes as the central grievance, strikes that have increasingly targeted the exact same category of energy infrastructure inside their own borders that Washington and Israel are now targeting inside Iran. Every Gulf government watching this specific tit-for-tat energy campaign escalate has to weigh its own vulnerability, since Iran has already demonstrated, repeatedly, that it will retaliate against energy targets in exactly the countries hosting American forces and cooperating most closely with the current campaign against Tehran. Now, it would be irresponsible not to give you the other side of this, because American and Israeli officials have consistently framed energy infrastructure strikes as militarily justified rather than purely punitive. Officials have specifically characterized targeted fuel storage and energy complexes as facilities being used to support Iran's armed forces, drawing a direct line between energy infrastructure and military logistics, rather than treating these as purely civilian targets struck for their own sake. Under that framing, a fuel depot supporting military vehicle movement, or a power plant feeding a command and control facility, represents a legitimate military target under the laws of armed conflict, regardless of the civilian population, that depends on the same infrastructure for entirely unrelated daily needs. But here's where that justification runs into real tension with how this specific campaign has actually been described by the people planning it. President of America's own public statement that he would destroy a bridge or power plant specifically for every attack on a ship in the Strait isn't framed as a military necessity argument tied to any specific facility's role in supporting Iranian forces. It's framed explicitly as retaliation, a direct trade, ship attacks for infrastructure destruction, regardless of whether any individual power plant targeted actually has a documented military function. That's a meaningfully different legal and moral framework than the more carefully worded justifications offered for earlier strikes on specific fuel depots tied to military logistics. And it's exactly the distinction Iranian officials have seized on in their own public statements, condemning this specific wave of planned strikes. It's worth adding one more piece of legal and historical context to this specific debate, because targeting decisions like these don't happen in a vacuum, separate from decades of established international humanitarian law. The laws of armed conflict draw an important, if often contested, distinction between dual-use infrastructure, facilities serving both civilian and military functions, and purely civilian objects offering no meaningful military advantage if destroyed. Power grids and fuel infrastructure almost always qualify as dual use in modern warfare, which is exactly why military lawyers on both sides of conflicts like this one spend so much effort crafting careful public justifications tied to specific military applications, rather than simply describing strikes as punishment for unrelated battlefield behavior elsewhere in a conflict. President of America explicit ship for power plant framing sits uncomfortably close to that second, more legally fraught category, which is precisely the distinction Iranian officials and international legal observers have both seized on in response to this specific announcement. Let's talk about how Iran itself has characterized this shift, because Tehran's own language reveals how seriously it's taking the change in targeting strategy. Iranian officials described the reported plan to strike energy targets as reckless, explicitly threatening to retaliate by striking critical infrastructure inside both Israel and American regional energy facilities directly. A threat that, as we've already shown you, Iran has followed through on repeatedly across multiple Gulf states. Iran's foreign ministry separately warned against what officials called the flames of war, reigniting specifically in response to threats aimed at energy sites. Language considerably more urgent than the routine condemnations that have accompanied most other strikes throughout this 6-month conflict. Let's widen the lens and look at how the broader region is reacting to this specific escalation, because the concern extends well beyond Iran and its immediate retaliatory targets. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain have all grown increasingly critical of the President of America administration as this conflict continues without a clear diplomatic resolution. Frustration stemming directly from how the ongoing U.S. and Israeli campaign against Iran has disrupted regional stability through continued missile and drone strikes by Tehran and its proxies. Every Gulf government watching this energy infrastructure targeting shift understands exactly what it means for their own exposure, since Iran's retaliatory strikes on energy facilities in their own countries have already demonstrated that this specific escalation doesn't stay contained to just the two primary combatants. Let's talk about the human cost sitting behind this shift, because it connects directly to the electricity crisis we've documented extensively already. This latest wave of energy infrastructure targeting arrives on top of a summer that had already seen millions of Iranians living through unpredictable, unannounced blackouts, industrial production slashed by as much as 90% in sectors like cement manufacturing, and officials themselves warning that patients on home oxygen concentrators face genuine, acknowledged life-threatening risk every time the grid fluctuates. A fresh wave of strikes, specifically targeting power plants and refineries, doesn't land on a healthy, resilient system with spare capacity to absorb the damage. It lands on a grid already operating, by its own officials' admission, with essentially no margin left to spare. Let's talk about the specific military reasoning behind why targeting energy infrastructure has become such an attractive strategic option for American and Israeli planners at this particular stage of the war, because it reflects a broader shift in how modern conflicts increasingly get fought. Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure, after 6 months of sustained strikes, has already absorbed enormous, well-documented damage, from the destruction of its S-300 air defense batteries to the strikes on Fordo and Natanz we've covered in detail. Energy infrastructure represents a different kind of target entirely, one that pressures the regime's economic survival and civilian population's daily tolerance for continued conflict, rather than simply degrading military hardware that Iran has already shown some capacity to slowly rebuild. Military strategists studying modern coercive air power campaigns describe this exact shift from purely military targeting toward economic and infrastructure pressure as a recognizable escalation pattern. Once a conflict's purely military objectives have been substantially achieved, but the adversary still hasn't capitulated diplomatically. It's worth pausing to explain honestly why this specific kind of targeting carries such disproportionate leverage compared to its raw destructive scale, because the psychology here matters as much as the physical damage. A missile strike on a command center affects a relatively narrow slice of a country's population directly, primarily military personnel and their immediate command structure. A strike that damages 12% of national gas production, as the South Pars attack did, ripples outward through every single household, business, hospital, and water treatment facility connected to that same grid, a form of pressure that touches the entire population simultaneously rather than a narrow military slice of it. That's precisely why economic and infrastructure targeting has historically proven so effective at generating internal political pressure on a government to negotiate, even when it hasn't meaningfully degraded that government's remaining military hardware. Let's talk about the specific diplomatic backdrop against which this energy targeting escalation is unfolding, because the timing connects directly to the collapsing ceasefire framework we've covered in previous coverage of the leaked peace memorandum. As of just this week, reports indicate the 60-day deadline attached to that earlier negotiated framework is expiring, with the broader diplomatic track still unresolved. The President of America has separately been reported threatening Oman, specifically over its role brokering a Strait of Hormuz deal with Iran, suggesting the diplomatic track and the military escalation are now moving in direct tension with each other rather than running on separate, parallel timelines. Energy infrastructure strikes escalating at the exact moment a negotiated deadline is expiring isn't likely a coincidence. It reads far more like a deliberate pressure tactic aimed at forcing renewed concessions before that diplomatic window closes entirely. Let's tour how different parts of this specific targeting campaign are landing across Iran's broader economy, because the damage isn't confined to electricity generation alone. Refineries hit in this latest wave directly affect Iran's ability to produce and export the refined petroleum products that represent one of the regime's few remaining reliable sources of hard currency. Particularly significant, given the sanctions, relief negotiations tied to the stalled peace framework we've covered previously. Gas export halts to neighboring Iraq don't just affect Iranian revenue. They ripple into Iraq's own already strained power grid, a detail worth remembering given Iraq's own history of dependence on Iranian energy imports. And within Iran itself, the compounding effect of military strikes on top of an already thin power margin means every fresh attack now carries a multiplier effect that earlier strikes, hitting a less strained system, simply didn't produce to the same degree. If this pattern feels familiar, it's because targeting an adversary's energy infrastructure specifically, rather than purely military assets, has shaped the outcome of major conflicts before, with mixed and often controversial results. The Allied bombing campaign against German oil production facilities in the final years of the Second World War is frequently cited by military historians as one of the more decisive infrastructure targeting campaigns in modern warfare, credited with significantly degrading Germany's ability to sustain mechanized military operations in the war's closing months. But historians also note that infrastructure campaigns like these carry genuine strategic risk. They can just as easily harden civilian resolve and deepen resentment toward the attacking power as they can force a government toward the negotiating table, and predicting which outcome any specific campaign will produce has proven notoriously difficult, even with the benefit of extensive historical hindsight. One more thread worth adding before we move toward how this plays out, and it concerns the compounding effect this campaign has on the exact missile defense weaknesses we've documented in previous coverage. Every strike that damages Iran's electrical grid simultaneously degrades the power supply feeding early warning radar, command and control networks, and the air defense batteries meant to intercept incoming strikes in the first place, creating a genuinely vicious cycle. Energy strikes weaken the very systems that would otherwise help defend against future energy strikes, a feedback loop that helps explain why the specific targeting shift may prove disproportionately effective compared to its raw physical footprint, degrading not just civilian quality of life, but the country's diminishing capacity to defend against the next wave of exactly this kind of attack. Before we go any further, it's worth being honest about what remains genuinely uncertain in this specific story, because a shift in targeting strategy doesn't guarantee any particular outcome on its own. We don't know with certainty whether this energy infrastructure campaign will actually succeed in forcing Iran back toward meaningful concessions at the negotiating table, or whether it will instead harden the regime's resolve while deepening the humanitarian toll already documented across this summer's blackout crisis. We don't know how much further Iran's own retaliatory strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure might escalate before regional partners currently frustrated with the pace of this conflict decide they've absorbed enough collateral damage to intervene diplomatically themselves. What we can say with confidence is that this specific shift from primarily military and nuclear targeting toward explicit, publicly threatened energy infrastructure retaliation represents a genuine change in how this war is being fought, not simply another entry in a list of strikes that has grown too long for most casual observers to track individually. So, where does this actually go from here? If this specific pressure campaign succeeds in pushing Iran back toward the stalled negotiating table before the current diplomatic deadline expires entirely, this wave of energy strikes may eventually be remembered as the moment military pressure finally broke the stalemate that months of purely military targeting hadn't managed to resolve on its own. That's clearly the calculated bet behind President of America's explicit ship for power plant threat. But if Iran's retaliatory strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure continue escalating in response, and if the humanitarian toll documented across this summer's blackout crisis deepens further under the weight of fresh strikes landing on an already razor-thin power margin, this specific campaign risks becoming the trigger for exactly the kind of broader regional energy crisis we've warned was sitting just beneath the surface of this entire conflict, one that could draw in the exact Gulf partners currently urging restraint from every side. If you want to track where this specific escalation actually heads next, there are a handful of concrete signals worth watching, rather than reacting to the next dramatic headline alone. Watch whether the 60-day diplomatic deadline attached to the earlier negotiated framework produces any renewed movement toward talks, or whether it simply lapses amid continued strikes, since that timing will likely determine whether this energy campaign is remembered as pressure that worked or an escalation that broke an already fragile process. Watch whether Iran's retaliatory strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure expand beyond the countries already hit, since further expansion would suggest this conflict's energy dimension is spiraling rather than staying contained to the original combatants. And watch whether any additional strikes specifically target South Pars again, since a second direct hit on that same choke point, following the documented March attack, would represent the clearest possible evidence that this campaign intends to fully realize the nationwide grid vulnerability we flagged as Iran's single greatest hidden weakness, rather than simply applying pressure at its current, already severe level. One final detail worth sitting with before we close. Every thread running through tonight's story, the South Pars strike, President of America explicit threat, the 60-day deadline quietly expiring, the compounding effect on Iran's already strained air defenses, was already documented across separate news cycles most viewers never had reason to connect into a single picture. None of it required special access. It simply required tracking the specific hidden vulnerability we flagged months ago through to the moment it stopped being theoretical and became the actual center of this war's newest, still unfolding chapter. Let's go back to where we started. Iran has been hit by strikes so many times that another one barely registers as news anymore, and then, without much fanfare, the target list itself quietly changed. We told you this wave was different, and everything we've walked through tonight explains exactly why. This isn't simply another entry in a war that's already produced hundreds of individual strikes across 6 exhausting months. It's the moment American and Israeli strategy explicitly pivoted from degrading Iran's military capability toward pressuring its civilian economic survival directly, striking the exact choke point, South Pars, that we identified months ago as the hidden vulnerability sitting beneath Iran's entire power grid, now confirmed as a real, struck, and repeatedly threatened target rather than a theoretical warning sign. Whatever comes next in this war, negotiated breakthrough or deepening regional energy crisis, it will be shaped by a decision that's already been made. That the fastest path to ending this conflict might not run through Iran's missile silos or its nuclear tunnels at all, but through the power lines and gas pipelines keeping 90 million ordinary Iranians warm, fed, and connected to the rest of the world. There's one last thought worth leaving you with. Wars often get remembered by their most dramatic single moments: a decapitation strike, a missile intercepted midair, a leaked document splashed across every front page for a day. This shift may end up mattering more than any of those individual headlines, precisely because it's quieter, harder to capture in a single dramatic image, and aimed not at any one target, but at the everyday infrastructure an entire population depends on simply to keep functioning. Whether it succeeds in forcing this war toward its conclusion or simply deepens the humanitarian toll already documented across this summer may end up shaping this conflict's final outcome more than anything that's happened on a battlefield so far. It's worth remembering, too, that this specific escalation doesn't exist separately from everything else we've documented across this entire series. A country already managing a decapitated, internally strained military leadership, a persistently failing air defense network, a nationwide electricity crisis stretched to its absolute limit, and now a deliberate, publicly threatened campaign against the exact choke point feeding that entire fragile system, is a country facing compounding pressure on every conceivable front simultaneously. Whether Iran's leadership can absorb this specific new phase of the war while still managing everything else already straining underneath it may end up determining not just how this conflict ends, but how much of ordinary Iranian life survives the process of getting there. Thank you for watching. If this analysis helped you understand why this latest strike matters more than the ones that came before it, make sure to like this video and drop a comment so more people understand exactly what's at stake as this war enters its next phase. We'll be watching this story closely, and we'll bring you the truth the moment anything changes.